Take my advice. If you hear the chittering of scarab wings, just run, and you keep running till the sound is gone. Don't stop, don't look back. If a squad mate's screaming, it's because the scarabs are on him. You'll die right alongside if you try to help. The patrol had seen the scarabs before, tiny skittering things appearing just out of their peripheral vision, metallic beetles scuttling across the ruins. They had dismissed them as little more than battlefield detritus, salvage drones left behind by some long-dead Xenos force. The lieutenant had even kicked one aside, watching it tumble into the dust with a hollow clatter. It barely reacted, only resuming its activities. A few had sparked with strange green light as they worked. They appeared to be stripping down the rusted metal beams of the destroyed infrastructure, chewing through abandoned wreckage and dissolving ancient corpses with an eerie precision, but they showed no attention to the patrol. Probably just maintenance units, Corporal Mirren had muttered. Harmless. Ain't like they got guns. We'll file a report when we get back to main camp. So they left them be. 3 days later, Mirren fell out of his bunk upon hearing the first screams from the eastern watchtower. The vox was broken and crackled with interrupting panicked voices. A choking scream, then silence. The swarm was pouring over the walls of the main camp of the 212th. They were a torrent of Xenos horrors emerging from the ruins in a vast wave, a skittering, clicking flood of razor-sharp legs and humming anti-gravitic engines. They moved with unnatural speed, a living carpet of metallic horror. Las rifles spat out panicked fire, but for every scarab that was shattered, a dozen more surged forward, leaping, biting, burrowing. Guardsmen fell, shrieking, as the scarabs latched onto their limbs, drilling through armour, separating flesh from bone, injecting virulent nanoswarms that turned men into desiccated husks within seconds. Sergeant Hallen was on the Vox now, yelling pointed commands for gun crews to set up their pre-designated kill zones. They tried to rally a counterattack. Heavy weapons teams formed up, but the Scarabs reacted immediately, deluging each team, processing them into their atomic constituent parts. The defenders fell, their bodies collapsing into ashen piles that broke apart under the endless tide of scuttling death. By the time command was responding, there was no one left to answer. Only a hollow, static-laden Vox signal remained, whispering with the chittering echoes of something retreating into the darkened ruins of the city. So it's a return to an episode of LoreGear with the most unexpected choice no one asked for: CANOPTEK Scarabs. I thought it best to set this episode up with a little speculative scenario of my own creation, because Scarabs do not immediately present themselves as the most intimidating enemy tool. Admittedly, they are an unusual choice because, for one, the LoreGear series has usually focused upon powerful, horrifying or defining 40k pieces of war gear. Do Scarabs even qualify as a weapon or a tool in themselves? I think so. I did Squigs before and they're relatively self-aware, so I think Scarabs also qualify, as they're basically mini drones with no real control over themselves. But beyond that, are they interesting enough? Are they brutal and horrifying enough for this series? Well, you can tell me down in the comments below, but if you follow their descriptions in the lore, then I would say yes. But also probably not if you were ever under the illusion that somehow the tabletop and lore align in any meaningful way. Because Scarabs, endearing as they may be in miniature form, do little to nothing. They were mostly something you'd add if you had points free to secure passive secondary objectives. This, though, is of course why the lore side of 40k is far more interesting, because so often do we find it to be true that weapons that are mid or worse in their tabletop representation turn out to be completely brutally insane when we look at their actual descriptions in the lore. Strangely in stark contrast to some of the supposedly most extreme outlawed Imperial weapons in the lore, which can actually be stunningly dull. It tends to be, so they're basically the things we have now and have used in war in the 20th century. The Imperium, who would raise worlds of anyone who dared say no to being conquered by a demigod figure whose basic rule of thumb was just try me, That Imperium said, hang on, these weapons seem a bit much, don't you think? But also, let's just keep some Exterminatus shells in stock. Those are fine. Yeah, so it's all very consistent and logical. Phosphex and nuclear weapons, no. Exterminatus, no problem. I've considered talking before because I could rant all day about the ridiculous void that exists between miniatures and the narrative lore. And yes, of course I understand that this is a necessary thing to stop the game from being completely broken, but it still takes every fibre in my body to just not rant about, say, Ivrain, who is the leader of the Inari, their figure of absolute power, who wields a weapon of Eldar gods, and who some might argue is the new hope for the entire Eldar race, carrying a sword that should, and I quote, turn its victims to ash with the slightest touch. Yeah, because it's literally a sword of death. It even used to have an ability called Instant Death in past editions. But in the last 2 editions of 40k, they decided to fit it with a profile that has no resemblance whatsoever to its lore or position as the named weapon of a core leader. It now has a feature of only 5 attacks, strength 4, -3 AP, damage 2. Oh, it's got devastating wounds. Now, I apologise to those of you that this means nothing. All you need to take away from this is that the lore and game profiles do not even come close to aligning, and it never stops bothering me. For example, recently, the new Krieg dude on his big horse, what's his weapon? A las pistol. At least give him a named weapon which is a little bit, something spicy. This is the stuff which maybe doesn't keep me awake at night, but it definitely lives rent-free in my head. Anyway, Scarabs, more than slightly derailed myself there after the first paragraph. Necron Scarabs are basically the worker drones of a Necron tomb. They feature primarily a beetle-like appearance with a single glowing eye, spindly limbs and mandibles. Despite their lowly status, they are extremely mobile and can even fly through the use of hyperplastic wings, contragrav engines and gravitic impellers. The origin of Scarabs, though, is somewhat unclear, obviously, because when the Necron tier underwent their great biotransference, they were in their original bipedal humanoidish form. So it's unclear whether Scarabs were just something that was part of society already and appeared at that time. It seems very unlikely. It's more probable that they're a construct along with much of the Necron technology that appeared much later to support their growing undead empire. Scarabs appear alongside the likes of CANOPTEK wraiths, that is in the role of caretaking tomb worlds. Over millions of years, even the larger tomb sentinels would not necessarily be continually active because nothing much is happening on a tomb world. So the Scarabs operate on a very simple set of instructions, carrying out maintenance and upkeep for a tomb. They're capable of breaking down essentially any material into energy. They can reproduce themselves easily using materials converted around them, and this self-replication is essential for their role in a tomb over the long term. But it's equally beneficial when they're deployed in battle. While a wraith can use its reality phasing destabilization matrix to reach inside complex Necron machinery and basically phase through solid material, but Scarabs are more concerned with the minor superficial surface repairs and general cleanup of Necron tomb complexes from any kind of damaged technology. It is said that given enough of their number, CANOPTEK Scarabs could theoretically break down an entire hive city, which is both believable and horrifying. They would then be able to reform the energy and matter into anything from a Necron fleet to a new tomb city ready for Necrons to inhabit. Although I think very obviously you would need some CANOPTEKs, Crypteks, Lords, etc. to really make that kind of thing work. But in saying that, the Scarab's role is just as important as the higher CANOPTEK forms, as they exist to prevent major deterioration in a tomb from taking hold. Of course, even with the best efforts of the CANOPTEKs by M41, it's very evident that the weathering ages of millions of years still takes a heavy toll on a tomb world, and for some much worse than others. Seemingly the CANOPTEKs and Scarabs' best efforts cannot prevent major failure. But overall, their existence helps give a fighting chance for a dynasty to survive its extremely long hibernation. Within their tombs, for example, there are other variants like the Sepulchral Scarabs, who are specifically attached to CANOPTEK tomb stalkers and sentinels existing inside the carapace of the war machines themselves. They would emerge to rapidly heal it, and these kind of specializations are necessary for the role occupied by solitary guardians of a tomb complex who may need repairs in isolation before other CANOPTEK forces can arrive. But in battle, despite Scarabs having no direct ranged or significant melee weapons, their claws are still made from that same living metal as other Necron, and so they're sufficiently sharp enough to carve easily through most enemies. Scarabs have minimal ability though to withstand enemy weapons, and so they must overcome this through sheer weight of numbers. But their size is small, enabling them to find cover and ambush small groups of, say, unsuspecting guardsmen. It's even been described that they will eat weapons as they come into contact with a swarm, so you could imagine a sergeant or commander swinging their sword into a swarm only to be left with nothing but a handle in his hand. Still, for these Scarabs to make any kind of productive attack upon something more substantial than just infantry, they need their massed numbers of a swarm, because this enables them a collective swarming strength like a plague of living metal locusts. At the same time, that's obviously going to make them even more vulnerable to blast or torrent weaponry. But one of the most intimidating aspects of Scarabs is their self-replication, because if they have no more immediately significant purpose, then they will expend all their energy upon breaking down suitable materials around them and then swarm replication. Given the availability of materials, Scarabs could continue self-replicating almost exponentially, making the only solution to deal with them some extreme level of bombardment, similar to that needed against Tyranid and Orc masses. And similar to those Horde Xenos, the swarm wave approach is often how Scarabs are used in battle. They are the immense wave which goes forward of chittering fodder that will cause an enemy to waste considerable resources to prevent themselves being completely overrun. It has been said that these swarms are often in such numbers that they could literally blot out the sun itself from whatever planet they are upon. It's a known fear-inducing factor to be exploited by Necron overlords directing battles toward those who have no concept of what they're facing. Hardened Imperials, though, will know how to hold the line against these relatively weak enemies, engaging them with repeating volleys of lasfire and coordinated ordnance. Still, those who are less disciplined or less accurate with their fire will find themselves overrun, and not dissimilar to the other Xenos waves of horror that come crashing down upon lines of guardsmen, many will be running screaming for their lives even as comrades are actively devoured, stripped to the bone and more in a matter of seconds by the wing-scratching chittering swarm, eyes glowing as they pin down their targets and surgically carve them to pieces. And I think Scarabs are perhaps most terrifying for their unrelenting nature. While individual enemies are undoubtedly terrifying, they're at least recognisable as something approaching an individual foe, something that you could tackle and outwit. I always think that one of the most horrifying things to face in 40k are these wave enemies, the tsunami, that you either destroy before it reaches you, or it will just consume you. Tyranid lower forms are a classic example, fearless, relentless, driven by pure instinct to consume. And in that regard, I think CANOPTEK Scarabs are very comparable. They're not here to outwit you, use a carefully trained attack or deploy powerful weaponry. They will simply deluge you, drown you in masses of scratching, lacerating, unceasing consumption. Like so many Necron forms though, it is upon vehicles that they are able to inflict the heaviest damage. Although small, carving through machinery is a Scarab's core function. So while masses of Scarabs could swarm a vehicle, tearing open a space in its outer shell before swarming in and devouring all its occupants from the inside, before then consuming the structure itself and converting it into new Scarabs, vehicles can be one of the more viable targets for those smaller groups of Scarabs. Again, this is sadly poorly represented in the tabletop, but in terms of the lore, it's very viable to imagine a small concealed group of Scarabs being a solid threat. Because they're used to living in the depths of Necron tombs, they can burrow as well as fly, and so we can visualize how an Imperial Guard armored patrol, numerous Leman Russ tanks or Chimera, worst case scenario as well, Chimera carrying a full complement of guardsmen on board. My speculative imaginings would go as follows. Through the low light of a claustrophobic ruined city, the armoured column is rumbling forward. The avenues are narrow. Several times they've stopped to negotiate fallen ruins that are too significant a bulk to drive over or through. As they turn down a grey, inexplicable avenue covered In the remains of ruined buildings, drifts of dust and rubble pushed up against what structures still remain, none of the spotters notice among that rubble a faint glow that has no place among these ruins. The first vehicle passes by, then the second, and as it does out of the ashen rubble, a couple of CANOPTEK Scarabs launch from the debris, attaching themselves to the vehicle's outer hull. They're so small that their contact with the hull is not even audibly noticed over the sound of the engines. Within moments, they've cut through and are inside the vehicle. The Scarab begins eating its way through the outer cables and power conduits. The first insignificant system control fails. Then the displays go dark. Suddenly the engine begins to stutter. And then inside the tank, it goes dark. Emergency power backup kicks in just in time for the unholy screaming of the driver to begin. They hear a weapon being fumbled, an auto pistol shot rings out, but the rest of the crew are scrambling for the hatches. The confusion and panic slows them. A forward gunner slips the handle to get out and is fast being consumed. A blood-curdling scream flies loose to his mates. One crew member makes the mistake of attempting to help. They're trying to pull the gunner, who is screaming incomprehensibly, free. Half of his body comes away as they fall back, only to see the large, glowing dead eye of the Scarab leaping over the ragged torso at them, its limbs slashing, mandibles flicking out to sink into their target. The turret gunner manages to throw a frag in before slamming the hatch shut. The concussive blast rings out, shredding whatever was left alive inside. As they hang on to the outer ring of the turret, they're distracted by the sight of the vehicles behind them. A hatch blows open of a Chimera, fire shooting out. Crews are falling out of the vehicle in a haphazard panic. Even as guardsmen are throwing themselves clear, frags explode and they're shooting wildly into the vehicles. He sees one shoot even through a fellow guardsman from sheer panic. What they fail to see is the Scarab emerging blackened and smouldered through the side of their own tank's hull as it begins to crawl up the exterior behind them. Now, could a single Scarab take down a tank in the tabletop? Is very unlikely. It's possible, but unlikely. But this is how, in the lore, I would speculatively imagine Scarabs to be considerably more dangerous than they're seen to be, as just this disposable fodder that is thrown like chaff at an enemy to disrupt and disorientate them. In terms of an ongoing campaign, just like the phase-shifting abilities of other CANOPTEK forms, the Scarabs can be equally disruptive to bigger planetary operations and security. Because Scarabs can also burrow down through the surface of a world, undermine and access areas of the enemy that they seek to overwhelm. And given enough of their number, they could even be seen to create passageways to carry their larger Necron forms underground, who could end up deep within an Imperial underground complex to launch a new assault from within an Imperial bastion or city. Guardsmen and Imperial workers have little to no warning other than a sudden, alarming vibration to warn them of an incoming CANOPTEK swarm. The wall collapses, Scarabs spray out from all directions. There's no time to react as they overwhelm any in the immediate opening. They may also undermine buildings, with the ground beneath subsiding into deep sinkholes caused by the drilling through of the Scarabs. And even then, all these significantly damaging activities are not the end point of lore for the Scarabs, because within the dynasties there are many customized variants, which are unfortunately and unsurprisingly more disturbing than the standard CANOPTEK Scarabs. Now, the variants of Scarabs will often have very specialised uses, and so are deployed by the higher forms of a Necron dynasty. While Necron lords and overlords generally fight at the forefront of large armies of conquest, they are just as likely to take a personal hand in the more acute operation, if not simply for the fact that few of their servants possess the functional coherency, let alone the initiative, to lead such missions. And in doing so, this means that they may need to make use of any number of more specialised pieces of war gear, which could range from sabotaging a rival or detaining an Inquisitor to infect them with Mindshackle Scarabs. Alongside the likes of resurrection orbs, some overlords may carry what's described as a phylactery. While fairly innocuous in appearance, this small cylinder contains a swarm of sophisticated mini scarabs known as Nanoscarabs, and the bearer of a phylactery will, as necessary, release those Nanoscarabs to swarm over their own body, knitting tears in their living metal and bolstering the Necron's own self-repair abilities. It's basically a very fast auto-heal. A similar variant to this is also called a Nanoscarab casket, invented by the Cryptek Onyx Swarm. This vial of black crystal is also filled with thousands of tiny Nanoscarabs, and as with the phylactery, once released this swarm envelops the bearer's necrodermis, hastily repairing damage and flooding their body with synthetic stimuli. Yet where Nanoscarabs can repair and revive a Necron lord, they can also bring death to their enemies. CANOPTEK reanimators are larger constructs used to repair damage caused to a tomb world during the ravages of time or due to an enemy attack, yet they will also often walk alongside the masses of warriors deployed to battle, bolstering their repair functions through the use of their Nanoscarab reanimation beams, which emit Nanoscarabs. Horrifically though, while these tiny scarabs will repair living metal, the beam will cause any organic foes a far more unpleasant fate. To an unwitting guardsman, for the fraction of a second the beam appears upon them, it will appear little more than an ordinary light beam, before suddenly agony hits the victim all over their body. Their flesh turns black and falls away, their organs and bones begin to disintegrate as they're atomically torn apart and recombined in a hideous, gory fashion. To those around them, the sight of seeing a comrade collapse mid-scream into an ashen pile of dust is enough to send them fleeing before the death ray touches them as well. Necron Mindshackle Scarabs, also known as Cortical Subjugator Scarabs, are a terrifying form of techno-parasitic warfare used by the Necron dynasties. These small insectile machines are specifically designed to infiltrate and override the neural functions of their victims, transforming them into unwilling thralls of the Necron overlords. Once able to latch onto a target's cranium, typically at the base of the skull, these small scarabs will drill or burrow into the head of a victim before interfacing with and then controlling their nervous system and higher brain functions. The victim unfortunately remains fully conscious but loses all control over their own actions, effectively becoming trapped within their own body and a puppet of the Necron master controlling the scarab. These scarabs allow for precision manipulation, meaning their controllers can force their thralls to act against their allies, turn on their comrades, or even sabotage their own defences. And this can obviously turn the tide of a battle in a single critical moment, as leaders, elites and entire squads can be turned against their own forces or just simply fail to act without warning. This form of scarab can lay dormant for months, years, decades even, within the host, who is able to act seemingly as normal with perhaps little if any sign there is a problem, so we can presume that the scarabs control them somewhat but must also draw from their existing brain functions and memory. It's only when a command is transmitted from potentially many star systems, if not sectors of the galaxy away, along the cracks between dimensions, will a host be activated. This may not necessarily be some acute violent action either. It may simply suggest a very low-key course of action into the victim's mind that is not even out of character within their normal behaviour, but it will lay the groundwork for an upcoming assault by a Necron dynasty, perhaps many years in the future. It could, for example, be a suggestion to just relocate defences to a nearby system with some rationalisation to bolster that. It could be to fabricate suggestions of an impending attack elsewhere, anything to subtly weaken the defences of the network to which the host is operating within. So quite obviously, Mindshackle Scarabs pose an extreme risk to Imperial Hive cities and military installations. They're able to bypass standard security measures and potentially embed themselves in high-ranking officials, military commanders, vital personnel. A Hive governor, an Astra Militarum general, even a Mechanicus Magos could fall under the whim of a Necron lord. The worst case scenario, an Inquisitor. The potential for sabotage is so extreme. They can issue false orders, deactivate defences, even lead large numbers of critical Imperial forces into direct ambushes. A single compromised officer could allow Necrons to bypass void shields, deactivate planetary defense batteries, or just open the city gates to invading forces. There is then potentially the secondary impact of the demoralization, the panic, the horror among loyal Imperials in seeing their own leaders obviously betray them without explanation. Within the Imperium, human lives operate under this very rigid doctrine of hierarchy and unwavering obedience. So a sudden realization that their chain of command is compromised could lead to extreme consequences. At very best, confusion and disorder, at the worst, desertion, even mutiny. So a well-placed Necron agent could disrupt communication protocols, defensive strategies and internal security, throwing defenses into chaos, allowing Necron infiltration units clear passage to then attack from within. And all of this has the additional benefit that through the ability to control living beings, a Necron force that may have seemed not particularly a significant threat to a very heavily defended, secure Imperial installation will suddenly have the upper hand, which then catches defenders not only off guard, but completely unprepared as to how to deal with this spiraling active situation, even as those Necron forces are claiming and destroying strategic locations with minimal direct engagement. Effectively, the element of surprise here is overwhelming. So as I said in the beginning, on the tabletop at first glance, Scarabs seem not particularly concerning, but they are in fact potentially among the most insidious and terrifying of Necron weapons, especially these Mindshackle Scarabs, because they have this capability of unravelling an entire Imperial stronghold from within. Should a hive city or a military base fall victim to these devices, the result is going to be often total annihilation from within, as the defenders unwittingly aid their own destruction. Within the Imperium ranks, and as is often the case, intricate knowledge of Xenos enemies is woefully inadequate. Only veterans, Inquisitors, Deathwatch, potentially Astartes are really going to know just what it is that they're facing. And this is one of those examples as to why the Imperium deal with the possibility of any Xenos interference so severely. For those who may be able to detect the signs in time or suspect any kind of presence of these kind of neurological controlling scarabs, it's going to warrant an individual, a unit, an entire command structure, whatever scale is deemed necessary, being subjected to immediate extermination. For without such drastic action, an entire world could fall before a single Necron warrior even steps onto its surface. And when tens of billions of lives are potentially at stake, in the eyes of an Inquisitor or an Imperial Administrator, the termination of a few thousand is a calculation that barely warrants any thought at all. I decided to term the last several variants as Flayers because they all confirm somewhat to the classification given to those Necron who have become contaminated with the Flayer virus. That is, having a hunger for flesh matter that would make any self-respecting Necron recoil in horror. Those Necron known as Flayed Ones hunger and track prey with little regard for anything else. They're all but a lost cause and only useful as a disruptive deep strike unit to throw enemy lines into chaos as they mutilate and slash through enemy positions in a sea of their own blood. Flensing Scarabs were a variant designed to quickly separate flesh from bone with little regard for how violently this should happen. Far smaller than regular Scarabs, they're roughly insect in size, although that itself is pretty vague, and as is often the case with anything that can strip a guardsman to the bone in under a minute, Flensing Scarabs attacks are horrific and, yes, fatal. They were most notably recorded as seen during the Orphean War, where Dynasty crypteks assigned these Scarabs to the bulk of the Dynasty's troops to assist them in bloodletting and rendering down organic bodies for more efficient harvesting. A very similar variant are the charnel Scarabs, also used in the Orphean War. These Scarabs were also created to better strip flesh from their enemies with an array of flensing blades and serrated maws. The difference is their size, in that charnel Scarabs are more akin to a regular Scarab and therefore able to shred and mutilate scores of whole living targets into a quivering, unrecognisable mass of red detritus in seconds. They're not just recycling units. The resulting flesh and viscera will then adorn flayed ones that accompany them, appeasing their hunger. A notable difference is also that charnel Scarabs lack a normal CANOPTEK Scarab's ability to break down matter and use it in the construction of Necron technology and devices. They're singularly focused on devastating organic forms. Then you have Blood Swarm Scarabs. These are another specific smaller scale Scarab used by the Necron Lord Imhotep, the Stormlord. This blood swarm, when unleashed, swirls around an enemy, probing armour for any weakness before breaking through, leaving it vulnerable to more of their kin. As they burrow into the warm flesh, the experience is surely horrific enough. However, Bloodswarm Nanoscarabs have an additional purpose, for as they spill out the blood and soup of their victims, it will begin to then attract ravenous packs of flayed ones to any survivors in the vicinity, who will very likely finish off whatever resistance is left. So, as I said in the beginning, CANOPTEK Scarabs are not an immediate thought when it comes to a series focused on specific, interesting pieces of wargear and faction-specific tools of destruction in M41. It seems a little strange to have Nemesis Titan Quake cannons stacked up against Scarabs, but that's because I enjoy the unassuming tools that can bring down a world just as much as a cannon shell that screams with the voices of exterminators. For the true horror of the Necron Scarabs is not merely their cold mechanical efficiency, but in the way they are so often underestimated, right up until the moment it is too late. To the many inexperienced, untrained eyes of human defenders, they may seem little more than strange chittering automata scuttling across battlefields, lurking in forgotten ruins. In fact, they may often even ignore a guard patrol if they're in small numbers and just going about their business. So to the complacent guardsmen, they may appear trivial, something to be crushed underfoot or blasted apart in idle, lazy target practice. But such arrogance is a fatal mistake, which itself is an all too common theme in the galaxy of M41, not looking specifically at you, the Eldar. But by the time the first reports of strange occurrences are beginning to surface, malfunctioning orbital batteries, flickering lights that have persisted for weeks, whispers of men turning against their own, it's already too late. Those who should have spoken up but dismissed their fears, waved away the cold, unnatural gleam in the eyes of their commanding officer, the unsettling stiffness in the movements of a beloved planetary governor. Perhaps they were too afraid to believe the worst. Those who said to themselves, the Inquisition representative need not be bothered with something as small as a few missing patrols, a few inexplicable deaths. Officers who were troubled but feared to speak out, concerned that it could somehow come back on themselves. The planetary shield deactivates. Millions are exposed to the baleful green fire of orbital Gorse weaponry. Defenders are confused, betrayed. They see the once beloved governor, their stalwart protector, standing out atop the balcony of the tallest spire, watching impassively as Necron legions march through unopposed gates, turning his people to ash. Perhaps, in his last fleeting moments of awareness, he screams within his own body, unable to stop the external torment or regain control. But now, there is only silence, save for the skittering of scarabs in the dark. And then, the world burns.